Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of our Towards Life 3.0 series. My name is Mathias Risse, and I'm the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy here at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I am welcoming you also on behalf of Sushma Raman, our executive director, who will join us a bit later for this conversation. Our series Towards Life 3.0, Ethics and Technology in the 21st Century has now been going on for a few years. The title we take from Max Tegmark's book Life 3.0, Being Human in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. The goal of this series is to explore ethical and human rights related issues that arise in the course of the technological innovation that is happening all around us and might eventually take us to a full-fledged Life 3.0, a phase of life populated by entities that get to design both their culture, their software, so to speak, and their bodies, their physical shapes, so their hardware, so to speak. To be sure, there are plenty of challenges all around us already that occur as part of this technological innovation. As far as such a full-fledged Life 3.0 itself is then concerned, we do not know if that kind of life will ever emerge or when. But we also don't want to start thinking about its ethical dimension only once it's clear that it will indeed emerge. There is, in any event, these days no shortage of efforts to imagine what a future shaped by AI will be like. There's a long line of movies from Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey to more recent pieces like Ex Machina or Her. There's plenty of fiction from E.M. Foster's The Machine Stops and various pieces by H.G. Wells to a broad range of contemporary science fiction. And there's also increasing attention by scientists and philosophers to anticipating and preparing us for a future shaped by AI. Among them, of course, the book from which we take the title for this very series, Max Tegmark's Life 3.0. And such efforts at engaging with the future have ways of also then shaping it, because whatever future we will have, it can only emerge from how we conceive and imagine it now. And that takes us to the topic for today, which is intelligence and artifice, ethical traps in the imagination of AI. Our distinguished speaker for today is Professor Sheila Jasanoff, and her concern is going to be with how AI is colonizing our imagination of human cognitive and moral capacities. Before turning it over to Professor Jasanoff, let me say a few things about her work. Sheila Jasanoff is the Potsdamer Professor of Science and Technology Studies here at the Harvard Kennedy School, where she founded and directs Harvard Science, Technology, and Society program. A pioneer in that field, she has authored more than 130 articles and chapters and is the author or editor of more than 15 books. Her work generally explores the role of science and technology in the law, politics, and policy of modern democracies. And one of her main themes in that regard is the constitution of public reason, that is the exploration of how our dominant institutions, or among other things, that means that the exploration of how our dominant institutions legitimize the exercise of power in contemporary democracies, and how they do so very differently in different countries. And in that context, she also explores how public discourses are shaped by commitments to particular ways of acquiring and disseminating knowledge, which she calls civic epistemologies, and then also by visions of progress, which she called socio-technical imaginaries. Typical of her work is the formulation of theoretical frameworks that are then spelled out in empirical inquiry, and she has edited or co-edited a number of influential anthologies that follow precisely that pattern, and have advanced the field enormously through precisely such a combination of theoretical insight and empirical investigations. The empirical studies, her own and those of others, frequently ask what makes exercises in public reason succeed or fail, and thus also how particular visions of the future, once anticipated, come to pass or fail to come to pass. And I will turn over now, without further ado, to Sheila Jasanoff on the topic of intelligence and artifice, ethical traps in the imagination of AI. And after that talk, we will have a bit of a Q&A. Sushma Raman and I will have a Q&A with Jasanoff, and you, the audience, are also very much encouraged to put your questions in the YouTube chat function, and we will keep an eye on that. But now, really, without further ado, over to you, Sheila. Welcome back.
Thank you so much, Matthias, and really delighted to be back in this series that the Carr Center, as you say, has been running for a couple of years. It's, I think, one of the most valuable series that I see around us in the Kennedy School, and it's always a pleasure to be engaging in conversation with you and the others who are involved in organizing it, and particularly Sushma. So let me say a little bit to frame the ways that I've been thinking about AI. I mean, one of the challenges is that while I've written a good deal on biology and biotechnology and also on environment, AI and computers in general, the arrival of the digital economy, is not something that I've focused on in my writing, but the kinds of points you were kind enough to make about my work are very much relevant and in the background of what I'm going to talk to you about today. So let me go ahead and share my screen and launch into the prepared part of my talk for today. So I called it Intelligence and Artifice because, in a way, I want to turn the I and the A around of AI. What does it mean to turn a thing called intelligence into a modality called artificial? And how does that end up constraining our imaginations, as you suggested? That is indeed a thing that I think about a lot in connection with technologies. Technologies are, after all, firm and to some degree fixed, and they have a way of channeling. They make things more easy to use, but then they also end up defining those attributes that we want to foreground and use in the first place. So let me begin with what seems like ancient history a couple of years ago. So at Brown in April of 2019, just about exactly 2 years ago, two major American public intellectuals squared off on a deeply humanistic theme. This was in the political theory workshop held at Brown. And although these faces are well recognizable to many people, I'm sure, in the audience, they are Steven Pinker and Paul Krugman. Steven Pinker, the Harvard psychologist and authority on language and the human sciences, and Paul Krugman, the Nobel laureate economist who writes most famously for the New York Times. The question put to them was one of the questions that I think is back of this series, Life 3.0, is humanity progressing? And Pinker, most recently then the author of a book called Enlightenment Now, held forth on one of his favorite themes, which is, first of all, that we as a human species have been getting smarter, and the evidence he draws upon fundamentally goes back to IQ. That is one of his primary sources of evidence that we are getting smarter. And this was a quote from the Brown newspaper that reported on the event, that IQ scores have increased all over the world by about 3 points per decade over the last century. So we're at a very different place now. And as an apostle of optimism, Pinker cautioned against any kind of pessimism. So even if there are dangers in complacency, there are also dangers in thoughtless pessimism. And this is a direct quote from him. And if you're convinced that we're doomed, that if climate change doesn't do us in, then artificial intelligence will, then the rational response is, well, eat, drink, and carpe diem, because, today is the only day we have left and tomorrow we die. So what struck me about that quotation is the way in which artificial intelligence is already colonizing our imaginations of the future. He puts it side by side with climate change. And of course, he's wanting to deny that we should think about AI as a source of pessimistic visions. But he recognizes that it's got the same status vis-a-vis our thinking about the future as climate change does. And therefore, the question of why we should put AI in the middle of our imaginations is that lots of people are already doing that. In effect, they're fictionalizing the futures that we're heading into, and AI is sitting right there squarely in the middle of it. So I want to turn to what this means. And, people talk about how we get stuck in various traps. And I want to think about three of these. One of these is the story of inevitability. I mean, to some extent, Pinker's cautioning against thinking that at least a negative story is inevitable. But I want to say that to some degree, we're also in the grip of a positive imagination that is also taken to be inevitable. So this is John Perry Barlow's famous Declaration of Cyber Independence from about 1996. And in it, he declared that everything was changed. Cyberspace had become the new home of mind. And on behalf of the future, I mean, even little phrases bear looking on behalf of the future, that's a claim to some kind of representation of an entire world not yet brought into being. We ask you of the past to leave us alone. You have no sovereignty where we gather. So this is a plea for wholesale self-governance, autonomy, as we chart this future in which artificial intelligence and other machine dreams are going to dominate human history and human lives. Now, if you think about the brief history of these machines themselves, you can see why people are so optimistic. I mean, why it's so easy to be seduced. I myself, when I had my first job in college, worked for Teleprompter Corporation, and the room in which I worked looked very much like that second picture from the left, an entire room with banks and banks of machinery, the computers, and we had to feed in file cards. And, from there to the first set of desktops, there in the middle was a huge miniaturization. It was unbelievable. And now we have something like the computing capability of that room in our pockets and in our purses in the form of smartphones. And, it's not even totally accidental that we call them smart phones, because this whole idea of smartness has come to be shared with these machines that we've invented that are almost part of ourselves. I mean, if we had time, I would talk about how even Supreme Court justices recognize this, and have Chief Justice Roberts has declared that cell phones have become almost part of the human anatomy and should be treated that way for purposes of Fourth Amendment unreasonable search and seizures jurisprudence. So there's lots of reason to get seduced by the machine, and indeed so much so that this artist's rendition actually imagines this famous drawing of Darwinian evolution in terms of a living, breathing, autonomous machine. And I think it's quite an evocative image. So what's wrong with this? I mean, so what is wrong with these visions of progress? And I think these are the themes that are worth developing. Well, first of all, there's something profoundly problematic about thinking that progress is indeed linear in the way that Steven Pinker put forward the idea that, one variable of about humans changes, and this gain of 3% per decade over the last century suggests that there is a monotonic character of progress. That debate between Pinker and Krugman is also worth looking at because of the kinds of responses that Krugman made. He patterned as the pessimist, but even then, his image of progress was very much driven by his discipline, Krugman's discipline, namely economics. And one has to ask, along what factors and variables is one measuring the linearity of this progress? But a second point that is really significant to me because of the kind of comparative and cross-cultural work that I do is the universalizing idea that advances, in this case in AI, because that's what we're talking about today, that advances are synonymous with progress, that everybody wants it, moreover, and that intelligence itself, all of it, can be enhanced through the employment of artifice. And one is left wondering, well, what happened to culture and context? And we know that people have very different ideas of what their societies are like. If anyone's interested, we can talk about the comparative responses to COVID project that I've been engaged in over the last year, showing that yes, it's a pandemic, yes, it's a singular virus, but by no means have countries reacted in the same way toward this virus. And a lot depends on whether people see themselves as belonging to an individualist or a communitarian polity. Then one supplements that with whether it's a traditional society or a modern society, keeping in mind that these are just labels. Is it hierarchical or egalitarian? And is it secular? And where is the place of spirituality in our ideas of progress anyway? Because not so long ago, people thought that that came from one's religious persuasion. As you said, Matthias, in the introduction, science fiction writers have been thinking about these worlds of the future much longer than the technologists themselves. And while people, of course, talk about 2001, and I will too, they forget this much earlier 1950s film that also became a book, Forbidden Planet, the centerpiece of which was that the villain, hero, whatever, one of the characters in the movie had on a distant planet put himself in conversation with superior intelligence. The planet came to be called the Forbidden Planet because something terrible had befallen the human contingent that went out there. And when the explorers from Earth went to check up on them to find out what happened, they found these structures with these funny shaped doors as if to accommodate some strangely shaped superhuman force. And it turned out that these forces had no pity and no empathy, because in ramping up the intelligence of the human, the progenitors of this technology, the users of this technology, had lost sight of the fact that they would amplify the id as well as the ego. So these were times before Freud became anathema and non-scientific and so forth. So this was still thinking about Freudian psychology. And these superhuman ids turned into monstrous beings with superhuman strength were destroying the humans on this distant planet. And then, of course, there's this.
To allow you to jeopardize it.
I don't know what you're talking about, Hal.
I know that you and Frank were planning to disconnect me. And I'm afraid that's something I cannot allow to happen.
Where the hell did you get that idea, Hal?
Dave, although you took very thorough precautions in the pod against my hearing you, I could see your lips move.
All right, Hal. I'll go in through the emergency airlock.
Without your space helmet, Dave, we're going to find that rather difficult. To allow you to jeopardize.
So we know about Hal the malign computer, and we know that it was smarter than its creators gave it credit for being. But when Arthur C. Clarke, whose book it was interviewed about it some years later because it had made him super famous, he was living in Sri Lanka. And he said that nothing had persuaded him that his vision of what computers would be capable of was fundamentally wrong. And every capability attributed to Hal, at one point, even reading lips, has been shown to be at least theoretically possible. And of course, now we know that it's not just theoretically possible, even more has been achieved. And Clarke said that he had no reason to doubt that the vision that he had laid out there was going to come into being. This is before deep learning, machine learning, that these were just ordinary household terms. So it really is projecting decades into the future in a sense. But when I was thinking about Hal and the inevitability trap, I was thinking about a poem written 100 years ago, a poem called Futility, that's extremely famous to anybody who knows the English canon. And it was written by Wilfred Owen, one of the First World War poets who died tragically right before the end of the war. And it's just a short ode on finding a dead body in the snow, and it's written to the sun. But it's these last lines: was it for this the clay grew tall? Or what made fatuous sunbeams toil to break earth's sleep at all? So, it was a technological war, and what happened was the sacrifice of millions and millions of lives because of a vision of progress. And ultimately, what the question comes back to: who is doing that envisioning, and what are we trying to improve or increase with this idea of inevitability, that progress is a matter of advances and that technology will take us into that future. So that brings me to the second of these traps that I want to talk about, which is the idea of intelligence being a singular thing. Now, nobody who's dealt with intelligence in any sort of pragmatic way, including all of us who are in the education business, believes that for a moment. And indeed, here at Harvard, we have a very eminent scholar, Howard Gardner, who is associated with the idea of multiple intelligences. And here is a layout of the different kinds of intelligence that Gardner has identified. But one could talk about these separately till the cows come home. Psychologists do, what. So interpersonal intelligence is also called emotional intelligence and cultural intelligence. I mean, these are terms that are kicking about there. But one can talk about what makes for more or less of one. The point I want to make is that these are not intelligences that operate in isolation from one another. And so one may not have the musical intelligence of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, but one can still have some musical intelligence, and one does not have to be a fantastic language learner to be able to feel oneself at home in more than one language. These can be coupled with greater or lesser quantities of logical language or spatial. I mean, people who have enormous logical capability cannot always navigate themselves around cities, and people who can often don't have other forms of knowledge. It's always been interesting and amusing to me that the famous exam that a London cab driver, the black cab driver, used to have to take, maybe still does, was simply called the knowledge, because London is such a difficult city to know that the kind of spatial intelligence of London that you develop was just called the knowledge. Now, we think that animal intelligence has something the matter with it because it's often equated to cunning, which is defined in this sort of a way: guile and artifice. So with artificial intelligence, are we boiling down this amalgam of traits that adds up to the complexity of intelligence and rendering something artificially accessible because it is a deep reduction of what human intelligences in their infinite variety are capable of? And there's studies by now that suggest that indeed that kind of oversimplification is taking place when we measure intelligence through measures like Pinker's favorite quantification device, the IQ. So this is a book by my friend and colleague John Carson called The Measure of Merit, and it's a historical account of how a test that actually evolved in France was adopted in America for very different kinds of reasons. So Carson's book argues to some extent that the measures of merit differ across cultures, and the technological devices with which we go about measuring these differences are also culturally situated and different from one another. But more to the point, for ethical purposes, once we decide that these are the dominant ways in which we're going to measure intelligence, or merit or capacity or capability, those choices have downstream consequences. And as this little book blurb says, that they help structure educational systems, justify racial hierarchies, class, and classify army recruits and direct individuals onto particular educational and career paths. In other words, this simple device of the IQ test or other measures like that, like SAT scores, for instance, have deep impact and reach into the very nature of the societies that we're talking about. And lest we think this is so 20th century, so yesterday, let me give an example that is very much today's news. So in Britain, as some of you may know, it was impossible this year because of COVID for the A-level exam, the typical college entrance examination, to be offered in the usual way because you couldn't have social distancing and offer these exams. And so the British government undertook to replace the exam by an algorithm that calculated the level of capability of students in applying to university. Now, immediately it was shown to be a profoundly flawed algorithm because it was baking in averages without taking care of the sort of underlying social structure that produced those data points. And systematically, people from poorer schools, more populated schools, and public schools were being disadvantaged by comparison with people from more privileged, smaller, and private schools. And so this helping to institutionalize educational systems and justify hierarchies that Carson talks about was directly effectuated by this algorithm. And yet, here is the Daily Mail reporting in August that it's extraordinary that the government made this humiliating error, had to abandon this in effect, and that nobody was paying the price. So this was headline news, but it's a recent case of algorithmic bias that actually depends on the standardization of this thing called intelligence and attempting to measure it by exactly the kind of algorithms that then would get built into our smart machines. And then further, a piece that seldom gets talked about is the degree to which we choose by our structurings of the market to value certain kinds of exercises of intelligence above others. And I've been thinking about this in connection with some recent transactions in the so-called art market, where James Dorsey, the founder of Twitter, where his first ever tweet sold for $2.9 million, and then this robot-made artwork also sold for something like $700,000. So through the creation of these markets in which these kinds of expressions of artifice are valorized, we are, of course, channeling our own society's directions of progress and ensuring that certain kinds of exercises of our intelligence will be valued over and above others. And in my own work, I've talked about this in the context of co-production. So this sort of joint valorization of a technology and of the directions of progress, this is commonplace. We see that in all technological choices that we have ever made. I've talked about intelligence testing and its problems, algorithms and biases with the British case, and that then brings us squarely to the question of, well, who governs all of this? In recent years, in science, technology, and society, there's been a fashion to generate systems of responsible research and innovation. The term RRI has come into play, and intelligence and ethics is something that's on the table. But one might wonder, what is at stake, and are we talking about animal intelligence or cunning, as in the slide I talked about before, or are we talking about the more holistic kind of intelligence that subsumes all of those different quadrants and pieces of Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences diagram? The last of the traps that I want to talk about is the speed one. So every time one is thinking about technological innovation, certainly from a policymaker's standpoint, there's always the urge not to hold things up. And therefore, policies that are geared toward quickly getting things into the market are valorized more than policies that slow things down. But is this always to the good when we're talking about intelligent machines? So one can talk about the positives and the negatives, the drawbacks and the advantages of being quick or being cumulative. So quickness is the speed of the hair, and one can say that IQ measures quickness. Quickness is associated with calculation, with issue spotting in the law, and with winning debates. On the other hand, the slowness of the tortoise can be associated with things that accumulate: judgment, wisdom, experience, tacit knowledge, kind of skills that cannot easily be put into algorithms, but that lodge even in the body, in the fingers of a musician or in the vocal cords of a singer. And arguably in our society, we're actually trying to substitute the one for the other. And here's a little example that I think is indicative in American political culture and about the nature of deliberation. So here at Harvard, an elite university, we have the benefit of teaching some of the world's smartest students. And many of them, especially in the social sciences, have done policy debate. In the world of policy debate, the speed at which people talk has risen over the last several decades, so that now the number of words per minute has become an indicator of how quickly you can win the debate. This is because the standard of success in the debate is how many arguments can you cram into a particular set of time, and not how deep is the argument, how thoughtful is the argument, how profound is the rejoinder. So this is from Wired magazine. I mean, this is not exactly a low-tech environment, but it says a nerdy high school competition has morphed into a nonsensical exercise in high-speed talking. And then the article goes on at some length to describe, with very ugly pictures, I may say, to illustrate the point about how it's a nonsensical exercise in high-speed talking. So are there rejoinders and counters? Yes. It's interesting that the philosopher Isabel Stengers has written a manifesto, she calls it, for slow science, illustrating it with a snail. And then some years back, Demos, the think tank in Britain, also started talking about slow science, and one of the prime movers in the science policy wing of Demos, who is now an independent scholar, writer, and thinker, James Wilsden, talked about see-through science. See-through science is something that enables critics to look through, and this is exactly the sort of policy response that the person who wrote that LSE blog about the biased algorithm also recommended: the production of a critical environment in which you can look into the presuppositions of the scientific exercise or the technological design exercise that's being carried out. But note that making science or technology see-through implies that you're going to slow it down, because it's no longer going to be just the designers thinking and carrying out things by themselves without anybody watching over their shoulders. So we can talk about this at greater length, but the point I want to make is that alongside the speeding up, there are calls for slowing down. And what would this mean? It would have to mean an abandonment of the race to the finish mentality that currently grips science and technology, especially in the international arena. Who's going to get there first? Is it going to be China or Israel or America? I mean, in the cyber world, the race is very definitely on, with lots and lots of money behind it. But there are constitutive cultural differences that matter, and I often talk about this very different set of ways in which two colleagues of mine responded to the Google Spain decision of 2014 that said that Google, our memory keeper these days, should not be allowed to remember everything about us. Now, Google's memory is one of these databases, one of these storage tanks for artificial intelligence. But Victor Meyer-Schonberger, who is a European and at Oxford, talked about the fact that if our past is nailed down in this way inside of data science, then it's difficult for us as individuals to grow or to change. Whereas Jonathan Zittrain, my colleague in Harvard Law School, said that this is something that should be left to the technologists, certainly not to courts, because how an individual's reputation is protected is just extremely important and depends on courts to, depends on people who are at the forefront of technology to decide what the principles, the governance principles ought to be. So if we think that democracy depends on a thing called deliberation, and deliberation in turn is something that requires time, then this whole idea of autonomous technology and engaged in a race needs to be picked apart. And that, I think, is the problem of the speed trap. What would good deliberation require? Well, it would require a lot more input at the early end. And I've suggested some examples of people and ways of thought that are already calling for framings to be opened up. So are the framings ones that invite, or do they suppress deliberation? And one can ask subordinate questions under each of these headings that are ethically deeply significant. Who should define the stakes and the stakeholders? Because once you've said these are the stakes, you have a map of the stakeholders as well. In what terms should we debate the issues? And who is not getting to ask questions? What kinds of questions are not being asked? Are there alternatives? So are we engaged? When are we engaged in technological intervention? And when are we doing basic research? Is the issue at stake something about efficiency, which is the way in which many makers of machines think about their charge and their project? Or is it about human flourishing? And then where would ideas and definitions of human flourishing come from? And then what kinds of questions about society are we not asking? And these relate back to forms of coexistence, forms of solidarity that we're not necessarily factoring when we're at the forefront of cutting edge technologies into our questions of design. So what should be done? And here I'm wrestling with some of these issues in connection with a different project that some of you know about. It's the Global Observatory for Genome Editing. And there, in the context of biotechnology, we are asking questions that could as easily be asked in the context of artificial intelligence. So there is the paradox of urgency, that social problems present themselves, they seem to be extremely urgent, they demand solutions. But it's possible that the solutions cannot come right away at one blow. And this recognition is what animated two of the famous words in one of the 20th century's most path-breaking US Supreme Court decisions, Brown versus Board of Education, which dealt a death blow to the idea of separate but equal education. And the court knew when it did that, when it said you cannot be separate and yet stay equal, that this meant a troubling set of decisions for school boards all over the country. And so they said that the new rules should be ushered in with deliberate speed. So there is that word, deliberate. It's the same word as in slow science or deliberative science, that one should deliberate in order to do something that normatively is called for and that we want to bring about. So the questions of slow science and responsible technology can be analogized to some of these other landmark problems that society has already faced and continues to face. And the first starting point, I think, is to give up the notion that it's a race to a preordained finish and that how fast you get there is the only thing that matters. And these days, I don't need to say much about inclusive deliberation because inclusivity is on everybody's lips as an important principle to strive for in all areas of our collective social lives. However, if one wants to be truly inclusive in deliberation, how do you bring in the voices that are at the margins, and at the margins of what? Because these are because every social structure has margins, and how you activate all of these is a profoundly difficult question. And then what about the objectives? So supposing we want slow AI, what would the objectives be? Well, I think that thinning down the debate so that every time you say AI, people come back with self-driving cars, that kind of reductionism has to be avoided. That we can't simply take one or two or three paradigm cases and say that all of the questions about AI rest on those. Ideas that we are playing with in the global observatory context include a notion of radical hospitality. What does it mean to entertain views that are profoundly different from your own? And how would that affect, in turn, your own ways of principled moral thinking about the issues in question? And ultimately, we're striving to build up an idea of cosmopolitan ethics, that there may be more than one valid way to imagine the stakes and the applications of AI, but these different ethical prescriptions and understandings may be in conflict with one another, and I'd be happy to talk more about that, because undoubtedly the way forward that I'm suggesting, recognizing multiplicity, avoiding premature reductionism, and giving up on the idea of linear progress, these are neither the easy courses forward nor necessarily the most popular ones. So with that, let me thank you for your attention and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Sheila, for your brilliant remarks and for joining us today. So I'm going to start with something that is on many people's minds, which is the pandemic. So over the last year, we were all in our homes, working from home, interacting with others from home, but the world around us has actually accelerated on the technological front in numerous ways, from the use of surveillance technologies by countries around the world to track people, ostensibly around the pandemic, but very likely this could continue, to the use of effective computing technologies, to even the infodemic that is really spreading across social media and other kinds of technological platforms. So I'm wondering about your thoughts about the pandemic. Could this be a pivot point for us, a portal, as Arundhati Roy says, for us to really think about the development of AI in a way that addresses some of the different deliberative considerations you've laid out? Or do you think it's a more of an acceleration for the colonization of not just our imaginations, but also our bodies and our every movement?
Thank you, Sushma. I mean, in a way, that is the question, right? At any moment of crisis, what are we going to take away from there? And I think that it's important to recognize, first of all, that the potential is there in all of these directions that you've pointed to. And if one wants to simplify it by saying, well, it's binary, is it going to be emancipatory or is it going to be restraining of freedoms, constraining in some sense? I think that a lot of the key to this is going to be, well, who gets to do the imagining, and what kind of world has the crisis been let loose on, and what are our capacities for thinking about it? So I've been, since April of last year, running this other large comparative project, and I didn't put up its URL, but it's called the comparative COVID response project that my colleague Steve Hillgartner and I are running. He's based at Cornell and I'm here. And so we found that in a way, the virus has attacked the weaknesses, not only of the human body, but also of the economic structures and the political structures in every country where the pandemic has struck hard. So to that extent, it suggests that our capacity to come out on the sort of positive end of the spectrum that you're sketching out depends on a willingness to recognize that these weaknesses do exist, that business as usual can't be business as usual without recognizing the infrastructures of injustice and inequality and so forth. Now, there are some areas where governments are seizing the day. So this morning, for instance, I saw that France is either talking about or about to ban short-haul airplane flights domestically because of concerns about green energy. I mean, so to some extent, European countries are taking this opportunity to put through proposals that they wanted to put through because of climate change. Now, to what extent they're also installing this into their ideas about civic competence, citizens' abilities, and coexistence, I think there the record would be very much more mixed, because I think that people's capacity to diagnose, society's capacities to diagnose and really fully confront, what the structural problems are that have led to prior injustice. I mean, it's not the record of humanity is not great on that front. But I think that the very fact that we're having these conversations, that many people are involved, I mean, to some extent, that is a huge blessing. But one has to recognize that one has to ask the right questions in the first place. And there is a kind of inertia in deep-seated political cultures that the questions this time are the same ones as the last time, that one is fighting the last war metaphorically. And, so I'm optimistic that the right questions are being raised, but not necessarily optimistic that they will stay afloat in the places that matter and that we won't go back to business as usual ways of thinking, except possibly with regard to climate change.
Thank you, Sheila, from my end as well. I'd like to follow up on this parallel to the genome editing context that you drew on a couple of occasions, and you mentioned at some point fairly early on that there's a set of questions that arise in that context that arise in very similar ways in the AI domain, and then you also ended up with the reference to the gene editing observatory. So I completely agree that there's parallel questions and parallel ways of wondering about the pace and kind of science and the public input and the debate that we have on it. But there's then also one really interesting way in which these are completely different domains, right? And that has to do with the possibility of an intelligence explosion. Yeah? So if you think about in the gene editing context, a few years ago, we had that incident in China where a Chinese doctor actually used genome editing techniques to change the genome of a couple of babies in order to protect them from being infected with AIDS. So he just put it right to work. And the response by the scientific community and also the response by the Chinese government was very negative, and everybody said, this is way too fast, and in ways that you would probably would approve of in terms of the reasoning you presented. But in the genome case, of course, we have this luxury. There's like, in a way, it's kind of going one baby at a time, right? So it's one person at a time. And if something goes wrong, there is ways of stopping it because it's only so many people that's been affected. Whereas the point of an intelligence explosion is to say, well, once that has actually succeeded, so in a way, once the AI research succeeds parallel to how the genome editing has succeeded, the AI succeeds in the sense of creating a general intelligence that is broadly smarter than us. then it can produce something smarter than it, and from there possibly quite fast. So in a way, the situation there is very different, right? The trial and error possibilities are very different. That's one interesting scenario where these are very different domains. How does the superintelligence enter into your thinking about the comparison between these two domains?
No, I mean, that's an interesting question, whether biology works as a kind of natural brake against explosive change, whereas in the intelligence domain, there isn't such a brake. So I think historians of technology will say that developers of technologies always underestimate the friction in a system, because a technological system is actually a pretty vast network. And by the time it becomes taken for granted and widely adopted, a lot of people will have had to do a lot of things, that it doesn't just happen overnight. If you look at even something that was quick, like whether it's the Manhattan Project or the most recent development of mRNA-based vaccines for COVID, nevertheless, you can see that the systemic side of it took a long time to build, that there had to be a lot of agreement, a lot of coordination, a lot of money, a lot of investment. And what I'm saying is that the sweetness of the technology argument, Oppenheimer's famous comment about the H-bomb that he initially disapproved of, but then he found the technology so sweet that he was seduced by it. That has to be offset by a willingness to deliberate on what kinds of societies we shall be. So which is the cart and which is the horse? Is it the vision of society or is it the vision of technological capability? I think that is where the question lies. And this is why I would say that the contrast is a bit too generous to the bio side, because in fact, that line crossing by He Jiankui did have a very deep impact on Western, Northern, particularly US and Chinese thinking, which was not at all wait and see. It was that this is going to happen, so we may as well make the regulations to make it happen. And that automatically means that something was sidestepped very quickly. Moreover, all of the sort of detailed contemporary history shows that this was not a rogue scientist. He was very much embedded in the science networks of two different cultures. He received a lot of positive signals about going ahead. And there's both textual and cultural evidence to make the point that things that had been considered forbidden before He Jiankui edited his two babies became, well, this is inevitable. It fell into the inevitability trap. It stopped being unimaginable and became, oh yeah, imaginable and therefore subject to constraint. But we're talking about where the vision of the unimaginable should come from. I mean, what things should we not do, regardless of whether we can do it or not? And, it's those prohibitions that we should not leave to just the advancing theater of technology and say, well, these capabilities are going to arise, so we may as well accept them open-armed. And one of the reasons we should not is that the technologist's imagination of what the technology does is always a reductionist one. It's always focalized on the particular attribute that people are trying to enhance and not on other attributes. So, are we going to treat a disease? Well, we treat the symptom in the body, but not, for instance, how the family is dealing with it. In this country, we have devoted less attention to palliative medicine, that is what to do with bodies that are decaying, than to the silver bullet cure. And, okay, if you did have the fully silver bullet cure, then maybe you wouldn't need palliation. But in the meantime, there is an entire social structure that is suffering and is overburdened and so on and so forth. It is interesting that many of the gains on the death statistics for COVID have arisen because of improvements in hospital care and not because of the vaccines. and that these predated the vaccines in a sense. So, it's a kind of grand global scale demonstration that the point of intervention at which you choose to tackle a problem has repercussions for the, disastrous quality of the impacts. But if you take a technology, any technology, that enhances a particular set of traits or a particular kind of ability, and the tendency of the discoverer, the inventor capital, which follows the inventor, is to focus in on that tendency and not into the wider context in which that will be effectuated in one way or another. I mean, this is why I use the word trap, because these are really mental traps that make us buy into notions of progress, which themselves are what we need to think about and critique. The what kinds of societies shall we be is a deep question in a world that is as riven with inequality as our planet is.
We have a question from our audience. What do you think about AI being incorporated in systems of justice? Is it a good idea to imagine a Supreme Court oriented by an intelligence system?
Well, this is a question that comes up very often, and thanks to whoever asked it. It's buried in the things that I was saying about what is the aim of rendering the justice? I mean, to the extent that we think that justice is about treating every individual according to their just deserts, and that all kinds of things ought to have discretion built in, then the idea of putting a machine in charge is a little frightening, because it would tend to standardize things, choices and questions that ought not to be standardized. It depends a little bit on what our idea of the human system is. Is it biased, prone to error? Are we swayed by studies that say that judges who render judgment after lunch tend to be more lenient than the ones who render judgments right before lunch? Are we thinking of judging as simply like a biological machine that makes errors, and now we're plugging on a computerized machine that will correct for more errors? I think that an experiment that ought to be tried, though maybe we don't know how to do it, is how do we breed greater humanity in the judges of the world, and seeing, whether people have more satisfaction at the end of the day with such decisions. One can say empirically that compulsory sentencing, which was a way of trying to make judging more mechanical, that those things have failed. On the other hand, with complex antitrust lawsuits where you need to digest huge amounts of material, having search engines that go through big dossiers, I mean, this can be immensely time-consuming, and it may be more efficient to stick in machines that do some of that scut work of society. So it's not a blanket answer, but I would be fearful of a society in which the capacity to make wise decisions is short-circuited by a desire for efficiency, objectivity, and the same solution all the time. Because I think we all know from our personal experience that we do not always want to be treated like the next person in line.
Sheila, I think we could go on for another hour, but we are out of time. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Sushma, thank you so much. It's been a